So I'm going to have to just go through this very, very quickly, but I'm grateful for the invitation to speak. Very sorry for my screw up with the calendar. This talk is really juggling three different philosophers of math and logic in the air. So I'm really interested in both the 90th anniversary of the publication of the Gödel paper and the 100th anniversary of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. And what I'm going to do is to talk a little bit about the ideal, which I think Gödel shared with Wittgenstein. What is it to be committed to exact thinking about truth? So this is a purely philosophical talk, as I say, with three balls in the air, because actually what I want to do is to trace both Wittgenstein and Gödel back to Russell. Okay, so let's see here. I'm okay. So the question is, how did early Wittgenstein and how did Gödel in his work on the incompleteness theorem, how did they attempt to achieve exact thinking about truth? And my answer is that they were both crucially inspired by Russell. And so this talk is really about juggling these three in the air and tracing back Gödel's views on truth to Russell and Wittgenstein, because I want to attack the idea that Gödel was some kind of naive Platonist, and particularly in his later work after 1930. Okay, so I seem to be, all right, so the thing we have to look to see the source of Gödel's thinking about truth in philosophy is Russell's theory of truth in Principia, the multiple relation theory of judgment. And this stimulated both Wittgenstein and Gödel to philosophize about the nature of truth. So this is the crucial common source for their thinking, Wittgenstein and Gödel. And this multiple relation theory is importantly not a linguistic theory of truth, nor is it conventionalism, but a view of true judgment as in some sense correspondence with the facts. So I will read both Wittgenstein and Gödel as realists, but it is not correspondence in the sense of a truth maker. What it does is to take the notion of error to be fundamental to the problem of the distinction between truth and falsity, which you must make sense of before you get into a formalized hierarchy of truth or any kind of formalization of the notion of truth and truth. So Russell's approach, as reacted to by Wittgenstein and Gödel, serves as a kind of counterpoint to deflationism or disquotationalism about truth. And it shows us that the history of the Vienna Circle is not merely conventionalist or linguistic. And I think this is very important for understanding what realism means in philosophy of mathematics. Okay, now for some reason, I'm not able to move my, all right, now I just briefly want to say, Tarsky, of course, made the concept of truth kosher for the Vienna Circle. Gödel got to the undefinability of truth through Principia before Tarsky in 1930. He did that by reading Russell's presentation of this multiple relation theory of truth. So Tarsky rigorized the notion of definable set mathematically, but Tarsky leaves the problem of where truth enters the hierarchy or enters the picture alone. Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein, Gödel, and Turing, none of them felt that Tarsky had done much philosophically, and even quite naturalists needed to address the issues. So I'm going to have to go very quickly here, but I want to read you a passage from Russell, 1907, on James. Russell says, I think there is an impression in the mind of William James, as of some other pragmatists, that pragmatism involves a more open mind than its opposite. As regards scientific questions, or even the less important questions of philosophy, this is no doubt more or less the case. But as regards the fundamental questions of philosophy, especially as regards what I consider the fundamental question, those are Russell's italics, namely the nature of truth, pragmatism is absolutely dogmatic. Dogmatism in fundamentals is more or less unavoidable in philosophy, and I do not blame pragmatists for what could not be otherwise. But I demur to their claim to a greater open-mindedness than is or may be possessed by their critics. So Russell is attacking pragmatism as a theory of truth. And Wittgenstein responds to this in the Tractatus. Avoid dogma so far as possible, but admit that there is some dogma in treating the fundamental question, the nature of truth, with precision, while granting pragmatism a place in general scientific theorizing in everyday life. In fact, all of Wittgenstein's philosophy through his later work sets itself this task, and so does Gödel's. And so I want to read Wittgenstein and Gödel as much closer than I think Gödel and Wittgenstein read themselves. Now, the Tractatus elucidated the notion of truth as something formal, shown in the possible activity for any language capable of saying how things are, of formally constructing sentences logically step by step from a basis of logically simple elementary sentences that may be used to affirm or deny precise truths and falsehoods. Truth is shown to be a task or activity, not something dogmatically presented. According to the Tractatus, we see the general form of proposition, what's common to all truths, in seeing the possibility of this task of displaying truth conditions. But what we see importantly is possibility, not an actuality. And the key here is that Wittgenstein, and Gödel picks up on this from Wittgenstein, brings modality into the center of logic. For Russell, modality had to be eliminated, the same for Frege. But the Tractatus is not, in my view, Kripke is here speaking later, Wittgenstein is not presenting a possible worlds analysis of possibility. Instead, seeing possibilities, seeing through our claims, to seeing them as realizing one possibility among many, is simply a primitive, unanalyzed notion. And Gödel understood this as he read Wittgenstein. All right, so I'm going to skip very quickly. Okay, forgetting Frege. Now, the point about the multiple relation theory is this. Russell eliminated propositions as entities in the Principia to avoid paradoxes of quantifying overall propositions, and especially false objectives, negative facts. When a proposition is false, there's nothing that corresponds to it that's a negative fact. So the idea was to use the theory of descriptions to make all talk of propositions a mere façon de parler. But what Russell needed was something to play the role of propositions, for he wanted to be able to say something about true as opposed to false judgments. That is, the distinction between truth and falsity. So on his view, judgment facts exist, particular judgment facts, and are necessary for the concept of truth. The multiple relation theory construes judgment in terms of multi-grade dyadic relations among multiple objects. So we begin with particular truths, not general truths, not theories that we use to organize data. It's a bottom-up as opposed to a top-down theory of truth. According to the multiple relation view, there's no dual relation between a judger and a proposition that she judges. There's only one complex judgment fact, which is either true or false, primitively. True judgment facts correspond to extant facts. False judgment do not, but there's no representation or vehicle of truth like a sentence, and there are no negative facts. So in the case that Russell pictures, Othello here is seen in the background, judging that Desdemona loves Cassio. Actually, I think what drives him crazy is not that he thinks she loves Cassio, but the possibility that she loves Cassio. But in any case, he makes an erroneous judgment. What happens is Othello is in relation to some complex, all right? Cassio, Desdemona, and X loves Y, the form of loving. Russell was pressed by Stout and others on how this simple foursome could be an explanation. And in 1912, he adds logical forms, because what's the difference between X loves Y and some nonsensical structure? And then in 1913, he adds permutative beliefs, because what's the difference between Desdemona loving Cassio and Cassio loving Desdemona? So you have to get order into the picture somehow. And this purely extensional complex theory couldn't do that. It's a puzzling theory of truth. In every judgment, there's one and only one general relation that relates objects, that of belief itself. The mind synthesizes the objects and relation that the judgment is intuitively about into a complex. That's the belief itself. So the belief contains what it's about. But while the mind synthesizes, according to Russell, it does not unite these elements into a fact. The belief is itself a fact, but not a representation of one. The so-called subordinate relation in, for example, the loving relation is the subordinate relation, and Othello believes that Desdemona loves Cassio. The subordinate relation within the belief does not, in being synthesized, actually relate the objects in being configured in the belief. Otherwise, the false belief would correspond to some kind of negative fact. Now, Schlick, the Vienna Circle, thought of this as an ingenious theory in which truth is built up entirely out of differences. But Schlick argues that his own view is simpler because it rests solely on the relation of pure coordination or correspondence. But Schlick and the Vienna Circle do not face Russell's problem of truth head on. And Gödel knew this because he took many seminars with Schlick. He started reading Russell very early. And I believe that what Gödel did was to, I'm going to go very quickly, what Gödel did was very early on to resist the Vienna Circle's conventionalism and try to embrace and rework Russell's multiple relation theory, which Gödel knew the Tractatus had reworked in its own way, bringing modality in. Now, this is not evident in the Incompleteness theorem paper of 1931, but it becomes very clear in the 40s. So here's a remark from Gödel's philosophical diaries the day he accepts the invitation to write a Schilk volume essay on Russell's philosophy. It was always Russell for Gödel. Russell was the premier philosopher for him, and it was Russell and Wittgenstein by means of which he resists the conventionalism about truth lodged in the Vienna Circle's views. So here it is, philosophical remark. Russell claims the proposition A believes BRC does not have the structure A believes BRC, but instead BRAC. What, however, is added or supervenes here in relation to all elementary propositions appears to be not a new form, but a new content. All propositions revert to the same form, that is of belief, but with another indication. So this shows that Gödel is very aware of what the theory of truth was in Principia, that he read and worked through on the way to writing the Incompleteness paper. And I think that what happened is that Gödel read through Principia, saw Russell's treatment of the Richard paradox and the multiple relation theory. The multiple relation theory is in effect the 0th level of the hierarchy of truth that Russell presents in the introduction to Principia. So you have to get onto the hierarchy somehow. And the multiple relation view, which reduces everything to belief complexes, lies at the basis, at the 0th level of truth. And Gödel really appreciated that. And here he is in 1942-43 saying so. Now, Russell splits the concept of truth, and this reminds us of Tarsky. But the content to the entire edifice is this MRT. So it's not a top-down view of truth. It's not a coherence theory of truth. It's not a pragmatist theory of truth. It's a bottom-up view in which particular judgments of what's true and false give content to the distinction between truth and falsity. All right, now Russell calls these judgments of perception, and what Gödel is going to do when he writes about perception in his later philosophy is, in my view, not to be a Platonist who is talking about some faculty of perception of mathematical truth, but rather, when he talks about judgments of perception, Gödel should be understood as alluding back to Principia, because this is how Russell speaks in Principia. Judgments of perception are judgments. Russell wants to make clear there's a difference between perceiving Cassio and Desdemona, that is a two-place relation, versus judging truly or falsely that she loves Cassio. Once you judge, it's a complex relation. It's greater than two-arity. So what Gödel did, I think, in 1930 was to see the truth is undefinable by reading Principia, and then use the Richard paradox to diagonalize out, separating proof from truth in the incompleteness argument. And later, of course, he would use Russell's axiom of reducibility in iterating such reflection to establish the consistency of the continuum hypothesis. Now, people have asked me, how do we know that Gödel read Russell? We know that he read Russell because the Vienna Philosophical Library, nicely, has copies of all the slips of paper when Gödel checked things out of the library. And we also know that they were subscribed to the monist and other places where Russell's philosophy would have been shared. And we know that Gödel sat in on at least 4 seminars of Schlick's on Russell. And if you look at the slips in the Vienna library, you see that Gödel kept checking out Russell's philosophical works throughout the early 30s. He would check out elementary presentations of truth in books like Problems of Philosophy, but he also checked out Russell's analysis of mind and analysis of matter. Gödel was very well aware of Wittgenstein's bringing modality in order to revamp or rework Russell's theory of truth. All right, now I'm gonna skip altogether the quotations from Principia. Wittgenstein had an impact on Russell. I'm going to skip Russell's presentation of this view. There's probably more written on Russell's multiple relation theory in philosophy, in the history of philosophy of the 20th century, than on any other topic in early analytic philosophy. So forgetting Wittgenstein for a moment, let's get on to Gödel. Russell holds that the subject of modality ought to be banished from logic, since propositions are simply true or false, and there's no comparative or superlative view of truth, as implied by the notions of contingency and necessity. And in Sanford Che's recent book, he documents very well that Frege also held this view. So it's Wittgenstein who brings modality back into analytic philosophy, but as a primitive notion, not as analyzed in terms of possible worlds. All right, now I'm going to just skip right over that. So just to reiterate, Gödel in 1924 attends Schlick's circle where they're discussing the Tractatus. In 25-26, Russell's Intro to Math Philosophy. 28-29, Problems of Philosophy. All of these works he read very carefully. And it was Russell who got him into logic in the first place. So in my view, Gödel appreciated that Russell's theory was an alternative to conventionalism, to coherentism, to pragmatism. And what Gödel wanted to do from very early on was to develop a version of this theory for the foundations of mathematics. Now, Gödel disliked the effect that the Tractatus had on Russell. In particular, he disliked the idea that mathematics is tautological. And Russell embraced that view in 1918. We see where Gödel kept copying out places in Russell's analysis of mind where Russell acquiesced in the idea that mathematics is tautological. But actually, Wittgenstein never held that mathematics is tautological. He only held that logic consists of tautologies. Nevertheless, Wittgenstein did regard mathematics through the eyes of Principia's predicative structuring of definitions. And he always advocated the importance of non-extensionalism in the foundations of mathematics. So I don't read Wittgenstein as a finitist, but he did explore the limitations of the extensional point of view. Now, Russell tended to focus on finite cases, like Othello and Desdemona when he discussed the view, but he was always careful to allow that reality and perceptual experience may be infinitely complex. And Gödel would have noticed that. He had all these things open before him as he was writing his article on Russell for the Schulp volume in the early 1940s. All right, so I'm going to now, here's Gödel's strategy. In Russell's mathematical logic in the 40s, Gödel comes to advocate explicitly an infinitary version of the MRT. He'd been too shy to do that in 1931 when he published the Incompleteness paper. Truth was not a kosher notion in Vienna, and Gödel was very careful. He throws away the Richard paradox, and the presentation of the incompleteness proof does not depend upon any kind of semantical ideas. But in the end, what Gödel wanted was Russell's view reworked. On this view, perception is actually infinite at the outset. But as in the Tractatus, only the possibility of order is given. Axioms codify possible orders in experience. So in his essay on Russell, Gödel reverts to Leibniz, suggesting the need for the development of concept theory, but axioms and proof are to control that. And later on, thanks to Turing 1936, the notion of a step in a formal system is absolute. It doesn't depend upon the particular axiom system in which one works. So proof is controllable, but truth is not reduced to a particular axiom system. And for Gödel, this made of what Turing did a miracle. So here's the opening of Maxfill 9 to 10, and then I'll stop because I know I've used up my time. The first page of the Maxfill notebooks, the philosophical notebooks of Gödel in the 40s, which he began the day he accepted to write for the Russell Schultz volume. Nominalistic systems, perhaps fruitful if provable instead of true, then to contain analysis. From the possibility of negative being follows that of the being of a relation is a potentiality of the external world. What do these two little pieces teach us? My suggestion is that the way to read these otherwise cryptic remarks is that Gödel is still trying to make sense of the Russell multiple relation theory. And the first remark concerns proof, and the second remark concerns truth. Okay, now after 1950, Gödel pictured his opposition to Wittgenstein as Wittgenstein on the side of conventionalism, linguistic verificationism, all the things Gödel had seen going on in Vienna under the impact of Wittgenstein when he was a student. Gödel himself wanted to defend what he called Platonism and phenomenology. And he thought Wittgenstein hadn't understood his theorem. However, what I would like to say is that there's a more subtle interplay between them, centering around Russell's vision for the fundamental philosophical problem, the distinction between truth and falsity. Wittgenstein holds early and late that perception possesses the possibility of structuring in language, and logic possesses the formal possibility of step-by-step calculative procedures. Gödel reworks this and generalizes this. The mathematician requires perception and analysis thereof. Axioms control proof, but truth is extraction of aspects from potentially infinite perceptions. So I don't see Gödel as a dogmatic Platonist in the end. I don't think he changed so much from 1930. What he did was to become more sophisticated and dialectical about his understanding of the way in which Russell's multiple relation theory of truth would have to be reworked. So I'm going to stop there. That was really fast because I had to go through the slides quickly. Okay, could everyone hear me? I hope they could. Okay, am I?